All right, welcome everyone. Now we're going to be diving into part two of our lecture. Now, in part two of our lecture, we're going to go ahead and talk about the JavaScript DOM. Now, JavaScript DOM stands for JavaScript Document Object Model. We're going to talk about what is the document object model. We're going to talk about iterating through the DOM tree, the selection methods for being able to grab a selector from our documents. And then we're going to talk about manipulating the DOM with JavaScript. We'll then break down events, and then we'll dive into handling events within JavaScript itself. All right. Now, starting off with the document object model. So far, when we take a look at our HTML document, is interpreted as index.html, and we could open it up and take a look at it as well. All right, we have index.html. Inside of index.html, we have a header where this header holds an h1 tag. And it also holds an image tag. Within this header, or excuse me, within this index.html and the body of index.html, we also have main. Main currently holds 3 separate sections. And we're running out of space here, so I'll leave it as such. All of them displayed within our HTML document. All right, on the right-hand side, we have the browser communication as to how everything works. But let's talk about how JavaScript falls into this whole thing, right? Well, JavaScript is actually able to iterate with this entire object, and it's able to read the entire HTML document as an object itself. So that means that when we're taking a look at our HTML document in JavaScript, we're not seeing it in the square format, right? We're not actually reading HTML and JS. So how does JS interpret the document object model? Well, it interprets it as such, right? We have a body that is an object. Inside of this body, we have a key named children. And this key holds multiple other objects, such as, for example, in this case, some of the children's are header, excuse me, I guess it wouldn't be this way. It would be more of header. And it can hold main. And it can hold footer. Now what is header, main, and footer? Well, all of those are their independent objects. Where we would have a header. That header would hold things. I might put this to sleep because it's getting in the way. That header holds children again. The children in here are along the lines of H1 and image, where each one of them have their own attributes, right? So for example, each one would be a document that holds something like inner text, where the inner text in my H1 header, I believe, is Corsair vanilla dev. And I don't think there's any sort of decoration in there, so that would be it for my my H1 header. Then I will have my image tag, where my image tag would have an attribute like source, and that would hold the address of this Poke API. Right, so everything in web development is an object, or as I like to say, everything is just boxes inside of boxes. Right? Of course, main would look the same. We would have something like let main be equal to an object, and something like let footer be equal to an object. And you can see how all these objects are nested within here. Right? If we're taking a look at the hierarchy level, another way to take a look at it, or otherwise seeing the tree, we have a body, where the body holds 3 children. One of those children may be a footer. Another one is the header. And then we have main. Our header has its own children, where we hold h1 and image. What would be some of the children for main?
Div.
All right, so let's take a look here, right? If we take a look at our index HTML document, main does hold a div, right? So we do have a div there that is one of its children. Nice. What else?
Sections.
Yeah, we would have a section. All right, if I continue scrolling down, we have other sections and then another finalized div. Okay, so we have one more section and one more div. All of them within main. Now, if we take a look at this last example of div, this has its own children. All right, what would be some children of that last division? Let me pass this one on to Brandon.
I mean, it would just be the paragraphs and then the break.
Nice. So it would just be both the paragraph tags and the break. All right, there would be a break element here. And then finally another paragraph tag. Right, so this is called the DOM tree. We're seeing it as a tree where everything trickles down from the body. And we can see it as an object being written out in JavaScript. Now, how is this useful? Right? How does that help me at all with web development? Well, we can put this into practical application and change the topic. Let's say we want to change our header of Corsair development, right? How could I actually get to this H1 header and change the value of this inner text? And we have our example here. How could I get to this H1 text and change the value of inner text? Let me pass this one on to Cami. What would be the first key from this body that I want to access?
Uh, Header?
All right, awesome. So eventually I want to get down to header, right? But what would be the key that I have to utilize to get there? Because this is an object, right? And our
Mm.
objects have key value pairs.
Oh, the children.
Nice. So I can go ahead and do document dot body dot children. And if I take a look at children, there it gives me back some children nodes. Now you did mention that you want to enter the header. So the header would be index 0. And there it gives me the header. Now let's take a look at header in our code. So header looks as such. From here, how do I get into that H1 element? And let me pass this one off to Calvin.
I guess the index code would be then for 0 for children again.
I see. So I would have to do dot children, right? Because that's the key that I'm trying to enter. And then you're saying to apply index 0. And that gives me my H1. Awesome. Now, how do I change the value of inner text to just something else? How would I access this value of inner text? And let me pass that one off to Jake.
I honestly don't know.
All right, let's pass it off to Cami.
Yeah, I don't know either.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, no, not a problem at all. So here's our H1 element, right? That's where we're currently at. We're inside of this H1 element. And all we want to do is we want to grab this key and give it a new value. So I could say dot inner text. And there you can see that it's trying to return, okay, Corsair vanilla development. And I can make that equal to, hey, the inner text I want to make this equal to will be hello JS dot. All right. And when I press enter here, you can see the value change to hello JS DOM. Right. I just iterated through the document object model and changed the value. All right. Does anyone have any questions over the document object model and the DOM tree and how it works?
Yeah, just to so when you change the hello JS DOM, it doesn't actually update it in the JS DOM file like automatically. It's goes only to the index. So you're gonna have some like a mismatch in a sense.
Oh, got it. This JS DOM is just a JavaScript. It's just a script. It's not connected at all with our current project. If we look at our structure here, my project is client. This DOM is just an additional script that I wrote to demonstrate what the tree looks like. But
Okay,
there's
but
no
yeah,
connection
but then
there.
even okay, okay. I see. Um, and then when you asked Calvin earlier about how to get the second portion of that, the dot children, since you're already in children, my first guess would have been like 0 and then feed in another 0 within the terminal, the console.
Hmm.
Like it would have been body dot children bracket 0 comma 0. So you have to like it's not that, even though you're still in children, you have to re-specify children again and then enter text.
Well,
So the change is going to get super long.
so that's because that's a different type of children, right? So if we take a look here, here's our body, right? And our body has a key of children. And that's the first one that we're entering right here, right? Body key
Mhm.
of children. And then we enter index 0. So index 0 throws me to the header. Well, if I scroll up to the if I scroll up to the header holds its
Yeah.
own key of children.
Okay, that makes sense. I got it now.
Yeah, and that's why we have to do dot children. And then at index 0, that's when we get the H1 element.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
I have a quick question.
Yeah, let's hear it.
So if you were, I'm thinking of that like a terminal where you did the body children, children. If you were to clear that terminal, would it revert back to the Corsair vanilla dev?
Yes, it would. So this itself is just a processor, right? You could clear the information that's in here. So like if I clear the terminal itself or this console, nothing's going to change, right? All this information stays the same. But the moment that I refresh the page, everything goes back to its original value. That's because it's reading straight from index HTML, right? Index HTML never changed. This is what the server, which we saw here on the right-hand side, this is what the server is providing the browser. It's providing an index HTML. We are then utilizing the DOM, which is the document object model, to go in and change the value of a specific element, which we can change as soon as I figure out how to spell again.
Okay, so you're kind of giving orders to the server right now, is that right?
I'm giving orders to the browser. Yes.
Browser? Okay.
All right. Any other questions? Okay, great. Doesn't seem like we have any questions. So let's start talking about how this can come into play here, right? Because currently right now, this isn't really connected to my script at all. Well, let's add some events here. Here I'm going to go ahead and start applying JS. So JS application. And I'm going to have a button that is going to be named change title. And all it's going to do is it's going to change the title up above. Well, how do I write this? I can write this function inside of a script tag. And typically you want your script tags to go at the bottom, but for demonstrational purposes, I'm going to show them here within my body. So I'll go ahead and write a script. There's my script tag. And I can write my function now. I would say const change title is a function that will iterate through my document dot body dot children. It's going to grab an index 0 as we discussed. Then it will go into the children of the header, grab index 0, and then say inner text is equal to, and then say hello JS. Right? That's all this function is going to do. It's not going to return any value. It's just going to change the title. I can add this function by saying on click, I want you to trigger the change title function. Okay, let's see what happens there. I take a look at my change title button. There it is. And I think this is wrong now because my script is technically no, this header is no longer H1 or index 0. So I'm gonna move it back up here. Okay, I messed up something. And I actually need to call the function. So change title. All right, here we go. So now we're going to change the title. Now we can see it says hello JS. Right? We actually wrote JavaScript straight into our index HTML and plugged in a function to a button. If I refresh it, it still says Corsair Vanilla Development because that's the original value that's coming in. But this button holds a function that will iterate through the body, grab that H1 header, that inner text, and change it to hello JavaScript. All right, we see that again. And there you go. All right. Does anyone have any questions over how we wrote this script tag and tied it to this button to be able to change the title of the inner text of this H1 header?
When you call the function change title, why does it have to be in quotes?
That's a great question. So why does change title have to be in quotes? So in HTML, because this is still an HTML segment, right? We are giving it an attribute on click. And as you can see, all attributes, for example, this image source has quotation marks. And if we scroll down to other attributes that we might have given, such as ID, I don't think we gave many attributes. Oh, if we come down to the input forms, we have name and types, right? All attributes are given to an HTML selector as a string. So that's why it has to be wrapped in quotation marks. Does that answer your question, Erica?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. All right. Any other questions? Okay. It doesn't seem like there are any other questions. As of now, we saw the script tag work naturally. All right. But what happens if our script tag is doing something right off the bat? For example, let's say that we want this, that as soon as it renders, to just be already the hello.js content that we have, right? Well, what we can do is we can actually call this function. We can say, hey, I want to change title. And if I write it this way, as soon as it renders, everything works great. Like I said before, your script tag could either be at the very bottom or it could be included on top. And I'm showing this specifically for a reason. Now, let's go ahead and re-render this. Now we're getting an error. We're getting uncaught type error, reading children of null. Everything was working before, right? If I move this back down to where it was, which is here, and it executes, everything works great. But at the moment I move it back up to the header, it fails. Why could that be happening?
Is it because the document body has the two children index zeros listed in there? Is that causing the issue? Because it's out of
Yeah.
place and out of order?
Awesome. Yeah, so great analogy, right? So we have this dot children, and then we're saying index 0. But if we remember, HTML renders from top to bottom, right? By the time that this change title is being triggered, body doesn't exist, right? Body doesn't exist until line 22. So as of right now, it's telling me, hey, cannot read properties of null. I'm trying to read dot children from body, but body is returning null. All right, so that's the issue that's happening in this error there. I'm trying to execute something that doesn't exist yet. So how do we fix this? All right, how do we make sure that I can write code and that my code will actually be able to execute properly and wait for information to exist? Because that's the problem right now. It's not waiting, right? Well, this is where async defer comes in. You can add to your script tag async defer. And by adding async defer, that didn't fix it because why would it? And I think that doesn't work unless I do it in a one-liner, which makes sense. Whoa. What'd I do? Yeah, it doesn't seem to be working if I try to do it this way, which is okay. All right. We'll go into that here shortly. So now we're going to turn this into an asynchronous portion so that it awaits for body to exist and the headers to exist before rendering this information. Well, just like our CSS, we don't want it living inside of our HTML document. So we're actually going to move this function. Gonna Command X. I'm going to move this function. I'm going to move it to this main.js file that I have here that says, hello, we're connected. We're JS connected. You can see that there's a little bit of formatting that I need to do. All right, so there's my script. Currently, nothing is happening. Well, how do I connect it? Link to our CSS utilizes href. Script, which is meant to connect to our JavaScript, does not utilize href. It utilizes source. But it works exactly the same. I would specify the paths to main.js. And then it should work now if I put async defer. There you go. So now it's able to work through this application. Notice that it's no longer throwing the error stating that this doesn't exist. And that's because of this keyword of async defer. If I take off async defer, it's still throwing that error. It's saying, hey, you're trying to access body and body doesn't exist yet. But if I state async defer, what I'm essentially telling the script is, hey, I want you to read this script, but be aware that some of the contents that it's trying to do may not exist yet. So if you run into any of that, first, render the entire body. And after the body is done being rendered, then come back to the script. Right? So it's kind of like a try and catch or a try and accept. Try to read this. If you run into an error, render the body and then come back and try to read it again. All right. Does anyone have any questions over how we moved our JavaScript from our HTML document to our main.js document?
So just to make sure I've got this straight, it is basically the same as the style sheet. You just use source instead of like the href, and you have to make sure you have the deferment.
That's right.
Okay.
If
Okay.
you put that script at the bottom of the HTML, would you still need that async defer?
No, so actually, if I move it to the bottom, all right, if I move it to the bottom, I wouldn't need the async defer anymore. Because if I put it, let's say, in my footer, well, everything is being read from top to bottom. So now, since it's the last element in my entire application, it's going to be able to read without running into any properties of null. Because at this point, body already exists. So it's not running into that error, right? It would only run into that error if I place it on my header.
Is there any reason you would want it in your header instead of just at the bottom?
Let me go ahead and do this here really quick. Yes, there is a reason why you would want it at the top, right? So typically you want to place all of these structures at the very top, such as your links to your style sheet and your JavaScript, so that the browser has the ability to render the application at the same time. So for example, right now, if I run this refresh, you're going to see it quickly. It's going to render the Corsair. And then right after it renders the Corsair, it switches back to Hello.js, right? That's happening because at the same time this HTML document is being written, the moment it recognizes, hey, this exists now. And because this exists, I can now execute this script. The moment it recognizes that the conditions have been met, for the script to execute, then it conducts its operation and it changes the values. All right. If you put it at the bottom, it would read through the entire document. And once the entire document is done, then it would execute the script. Right. So it's more of a asynchronous versus post operation. When you put it at the top with async defer, JavaScript is being executed asynchronously at the same time that HTML is being read. Whereas if you put it at the bottom, it's a post operation. That means all HTML is read and then JavaScript is executed. Does that answer your question, Erica?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. All right. Any other questions?
So the reason why you wouldn't want to do that is because it's like slower.
That's
Is
right.
that
Yeah,
okay?
it
Okay.
would be slower and that could give a bad user interface, right? For example, if there's a lot of information that you're having being manipulated or being rendered strictly through JavaScript, which we're going to demonstrate here in a little bit, they wouldn't show up until the entire HTML document has been read, right? Where maybe you wanted to show up at the same time other information is being rendered. Otherwise, it shows a weird glitch where everything in HTML renders, and then all of a sudden there's an insertion in the middle, and then the website kind of like grows, right? You don't want that. You want it to render at the same time. All right. Any other questions? Okay. Now, before we start going into other ways of manipulating the DOM, let's talk about how we can grab objects, right? Because as of right now, the way we're grabbing objects is simply by iterating through the DOM tree. But there was something Brandon said that really sparked my attention, right? He mentioned, well, wouldn't the chain just really grow depending on how nested the document is? So, for example, if I want to enter these input fields, I would have to go into section, go into the children's of section. I would have to then go into the unordered list, go into the children of the unordered list, and then grab by index into the specific list item, right? One, that's not very dynamic because that means that the moment somebody throws an extra division on top of my unordered list, then this whole block of code is no longer valid, right? So there's got to be a better way to grab different objects inside of my HTML. Well, this is where selectors come into play. And these are called query selectors. For example, we have the document.get element by tag name, right? And this is essentially the same thing we're doing here, where I want to grab an H1 element. And let's just go ahead and console.log this information here. So when I call get element by tag name, notice that it renders an H1 element. This H1 element has all of the same attributes. So from here, I could actually grab inner HTML. Let's say inner HTML. Right, so it's giving me undefined. Okay. Oh, that's because I have to index 0. And I see Corsair, vanilla development, right? Now my chain got a lot smaller. I was able to grab from my document one specific element. And notice how this is get elements, because this is always meant to return an array. And that's why I'm accessing index 0 and then inner HTML. Right? So there's one way to do it. I can grab all of my elements by their tag name. For example, if I were to grab all li items, you can see that all of the li items that exist in this document are being provided for me. All right. So this is grabbing elements by tag name, which always returns an array of objects. All right. Next, we have get elements by ID, or excuse me, let's go with class names, which always returns an array of objects. And here we could do console.log document.get element. Here we see get elements by class name. And we could pass in a class. For example, let's do input li. And there I get all of the different classes or all of the different list items that hold the class name of input li. Right? This will always return an array. Does anyone have any questions over elements by class name or elements by tag name? Okay, let's start talking about singular things. All right. For example, we can grab by ID. And this will always return an independent object or no. And so it's either or. So now we could console.log and let's do document.get element by ID. And we could pass in an ID. I believe one of the IDs that we have is input text or list item input. Let me see here. Here you go, text input. Nice. So let's do text input. And now you can see that text input is the only list item that is returned. If I were to put something that's invalid, such as invalid, it returns null. Right? So get element by ID will always return the object or null. Does anyone have any questions over get element by ID?
Is ID the only way to get like a singular object, or
Yeah, that's a good
is there
question.
another way?
Let's go ahead and start talking about another type of selector that could bring a singular object. This one is grabbing by selector. Right? And this will always return the first instance that matches the first instance matching query. Leave it at that. All right. So for example, in this case, let's go ahead and console.log. And let's do document.object, or excuse me, .query selector. And here we can specify the query that we want. For example, let's say what I want here is an H1 element. Well, it returns Corsair at vanilla CSS, right? This is the very first instance of the H1 element. If I do something like li, the first one is going to return is this text. Notice that there's many other list items that are available, but it's returning the very first one that matches the query, right? Now, this query selector isn't limited to only looking up tag names. It can also look up class names. So for example, let's do something like, I think it was UL input. Let me try this again. Oh, it's input li. There you go. It can grab by class, right? This is the class name of input li, and it grabbed the very first input that was provided. which in this case is class of text. And it does the same thing for IDs. IDs are unique, so we don't really have to worry about it being the very first instance, but you can provide an ID and it's able to give you that one parameter that you're looking for. All right. Nowadays, it's more common to utilize query selector for pretty much any sort of querying that you need out of your document. So it's important that you guys get familiarized and comfortable with utilizing this query selector. All right, did that answer your question, Cami?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. Well, now, if query selector works for one specific instance, it's also got to work for all instances, right? Which will always return an array. So again, let's go ahead and console.log, where we have document.query selector all. And in this case, let's look up something like our input li, which I think that's what it was called. You can see that a node list is returned, which is an array. And that array holds all instances of list items that hold this input li. Right, so query selector all will return an array, whereas query selector returns an instance or null. All right, so for example, if we go back to this and we put something that is invalid, let's go ahead and do invalid, it would just return null. All right, so there's our different types of selectors. Does anyone have any questions over the different types of selectors? Okay, now we have all of these selectors, but what's the whole point? Right? Why do we have all of these selectors? I'm going to come over to index.html. I'm going to take a look at this relationship of children here. And here in this relationship of children, I'm going to take off this div container. Now, what we're about to cover, we're about to go over how we're going to be adding or inserting information into this container by adding some cards. And we'll be starting to talk about events, the different events that we can add to divisions so that they can start populating and having a little bit more of a dynamic interface. Now, this is going to be a pretty huge jump, so I want us all to take a nice 5-minute break before we come back and continue talking about events. Currently, right now, it's 11:45. Let's take a 5-minute break, come back at 11:50 to continue on with our lecture. Thank you so much, everyone. All right, welcome back, everybody. Let's see. All right, perfect. So currently I have this making card function here. What we're gonna do is we're gonna add cards into this container. If I go ahead and inspect this information here, come over to my console, we can see JS is connected. Currently my generate card function just logs onto the console, this making card. Making card is not defined. Okay, let's go ahead and, oh, that's right, because it's generate card. Have to make sure those two match, otherwise it's gonna throw an error. All right. There you go. So now we can see making card being logged into the console. Great. Now again, the point of this is to be able to add a card, right? And JavaScript gives us the ability to manipulate the DOM, meaning we can generate information, we can update information. We have all our CRUD capabilities, such as create, read, update, delete inside of JavaScript with the DOM. So let's go into this main.js. All right, let's say I want to generate a card. Well, this card is just going to be a division. I can create a division by saying that I want to create an element named div. And then I could just add some styling. I could say card.className is equal to card. Now that's going to create the division for me. And I'm giving it a class name. Now all I have to do is add it to this container. Well, the container currently has an ID of container. So what tool could I utilize to grab said container? All right, we just covered the different types of selectors. Which one could I utilize to grab the container? It's here,
Get
Erica.
class by ID.
Nice. Yeah, so I could do let container be equal to document dot get class or get element.
Yeah.
Nice. By ID. And I know that it's container. Let's make sure that that's correct. I did name it container. Great. So this will give me back my container. And finally, all I have to do is say container dot append child, because currently it holds no children. And the child that I want to append is of card. Now I'm just going to quickly create this card class so that we can see it. Otherwise, it's not going to work. Here we have card. I'm going to give it a height of, let's go with 20 vmin. I'll go ahead and give it a width of 10 vmin. I'll give it a background color of Alice blue. Why not? And let's give it a border. Let's do a border of 1 pixel, solid, and black. All right. Let's see what happens now. I click on add card. And now we can see cards are constantly being generated. And let me go ahead and also add something here. There you go. All right, so as I continue generating cards, they continue to occupy the container. All right, and they continue to add even after they overflow the container. All right, awesome. So as of now, I'm able to generate cards. Again, we did this by creating an element named div, giving that element a class name. And if we actually check this element, all right, we could see that the class name was added there to card. If I take a look at the console, here we can see each element has the class of card, and they're all being generated, and we're able to successfully add cards into our container. All right, we could add a button saying, hey, let's make a empty container. Now, this is going to look very similar, right? As in the fact that we're going to grab the container. But then when we empty it, we could say container dot children. And there's this remove children. There's also replace child if you'd like to utilize that as well. But there's a way where you could remove them all if you would like to. We're not going to dive into that technicality right now because we are running out of time. All right. Does anyone have any questions over how this generate card function works? Okay. If no one has any questions over how this generate card function works, then the next thing we have to start talking about is events. Now, every time I click on this button, this is an event. We can come back over and actually pass it in. We can say, hey, you're going to be receiving an event. We can come to main.js, grab the event, and let's just console log the event. Now, the type of event that we're going to see is going to be an on-click event. All right, so we can see here's a pointer event. It was trusted and it gives you quite a bit of information. It gives me what location on the screen it was triggered from an altitude angle. Um, Here's my X and Y. So X being from left to right and Y being from top to bottom of position in the screen as to where it was pressed. And it gives me quite a bit of information as to what's going on. But the most important part of events are usually their target. All right. Target being what element is it that caused this event? In this case, it's the button. Now, why would that be important? Well, let's say event.target, which is my button. I want it to grab the style and change the background color to red. Well, now let's see what happens when I click on this button. When I click on that button, it changed the background color to red. Notice that I never grabbed button. All right. Never did I utilize a query selector to be able to grab the button, nor did I iterate through the event tree. I'm quite simply going through the event, analyzing what created this event, and then adding this style concept. Now, this is nice because now what we can do is we can actually add events to our divisions. For example, we can make a hover event. All right, so we can say console, or let's do a const hover event. And what this is meant to do is it's meant to take in an event. Now, what we're going to do here is whenever somebody hovers over our, and I guess we should call this hover in event. Now, whenever somebody hovers over our specific value, what we want to do is we can grab event dot target dot background color, and let's make that gold. All right, now we're going to add this event to the class or this card. We can do this by saying card. I'm going to delete this portion here. We're going to do card dot add event listener. What we're going to do is we're going to add a mouse over. Where my mouse over takes in a function, and that's the hover in event. Now let's take a look at this. Add a couple of cards. Oh, it's not working. Interesting. Da-da-da. Add event listener. Let's go ahead and console.log event. Okay, so it's working, right? Every time I mouse over it, it's actually doing it. Nope, that renders it badly. All right, I'll have to figure out how to nest these in between, but let me go ahead and grab this body. I'm gonna bring this down.
Was it because you weren't calling the event or the function, you were just writing the name?
I thought that's what it was, but when I tried to adjust that, it actually ended up creating more of an error.
Oh.
So I don't think that's what the solution would be, unfortunately. Let me try this out. Interesting. So it is console log in the event. I am grabbing the target background color. Am I spelling that correctly? Hopefully. Oh, that's the problem. dot style. There you go. All right. So as you can see, we're taking in the function. The function is grabbing the style block and setting the background color to gold. And if I add a bunch of cards, but only hover over some of them, only some of them are being turned into gold. Only the ones that I hovered over, right? Well, what about if I want to mouse out? All right, let's do card dot add event listener, and let's do mouse out. Which again, this will take in an event, and I could trigger event.target.style.background color and set that back to its original color, which I'm pretty sure was Alice blue. There you go. Okay, so now we add each one of these cards. There's 2 events added onto them. And notice how as I'm hovering over them, they turn gold. And as I hover out, they go back to turning their original color. All right, so now we have a more dynamic user interface where they have some behavior being added into them. And all of that behavior is being controlled through JavaScript. All right, does anyone have any questions regarding manipulating events in JavaScript?
So when you set the color back, did you have to like type in the color again, or is there a way to like revert?
Like go back to its original form, you would have to
Yeah.
type in the color again because
Okay.
we don't have a record. There could be something that you can do here where you could say, let hover be equal to, no, that wouldn't work because it would only, yeah, you would have to dictate them because all of the information is isolated. So it wouldn't be able to know what it was before. Does that
Okay.
answer your question, Kenny?
Hmm.
Okay, great. All right. Now, the final thing that we're going to talk about today is going to be forms and how we should handle forms. Luckily, we already have a form down here and we saw it in action, right? If I type in information, all that information gets posted up above, but it resets my entire application, right? If I add some cards and then I submit my form, all my cards go away. So that's not necessarily how I want to handle forms, especially in static site applications, which is what we're going to be building here. So instead, we're going to build a function called handle submit that will take in an event and handle the submission. All right, in index HTML, I just need to find this form and then add an on submit because that's the event that I want to take over. I want to handle submit function to handle this information. All right, well, why? Why do I even want this handle submit function? Well, that handle submit function gives me the ability to do this. I can do event, prevent, default. And now when I do Francisco and I put in a color, and let's say I add some cards for perspective, when I click on submit, notice my application isn't refreshing. It's not re-rendering, right? Everything still works. But the data, right? What's happening to the data? Because that's the whole point of a form. So let's go ahead and try this out, right? Now we're at our empty index HTML. I can put in my name, put in the hex that I want, and click submit. When I stop the refreshing of data, right, my single page application stays alive. But notice that now the data that I'm capturing from the user, it's not going anywhere. So what do I do with this? Well, now, because I'm taking over the default behavior of a form, I need to specify how to handle this form. So this part gets a little tricky, all right? The first part we're going to do is we're going to grab the data. Now, because it's very common for developers to work with forms, we were given a class named form data. Right? This is referenced back to OOP. This is how you make an instance of a class in JavaScript. The class is form data. And what it expects, it's a form element. So this class, in its init method, it's looking for self and the form element. So in order to pass in the form element, we could just pass in event.target. Because the target that is triggering this event for this form is the form itself. All right. Does anyone have any questions about this so far? I'm going over this rather quickly, so if you have questions or you need me to slow down, you need to tell me.
But yeah, I'm a little confused. Can you just like do another example of that one? Because
Yeah, absolutely. No problem at all. So currently right now, we have my data here, right? If I click submit, nothing is happening. But if I console.log the event, well, the event, I get a submit event. It tells me, hey, this is trusted, etc., etc. But then it also gives me this target, which is the form. And you can see that if I hover over it, it's giving me that form HTML element. Now, this form data class looks something like this. Class form data, and this class of form data holds a constructor. Oh, and that's I don't remember my JavaScript syntax for this information very well, so please excuse me if this isn't the best. This constructor takes in a form element, which is an HTML form element. There you go. Now, when this HTML form element comes in, what it does is it says this dot data is equal to form. And then finally, it has its getters and setters, where the getter for this form will actually return a JSON object that will hold the name and then this dot data dot name. And it will hold an object that says color. And they'll return this dot data dot, right? Somewhere along these lines. I don't remember my JavaScript for OOP very well, but this is essentially the idea, right? Where we have our init method that takes in only one argument, sets it to the data, and then afterwards returns the data. All right, so that's what's going on there. So as of right now, when I go to console.log form data, what I expect to see is some sort of descriptive that this is a class instance. All right. And there you go. That's what I'm seeing here. I'm saying, hey, this is a class instance of form data. Kind of like an OOP, whenever we printed the instance of a class, it just gave us the memory location. In this case, it's just giving me this is an instance of form data. Well, now how do I grab the information from form data? Well, I can say, hey, instead of using const, I'm going to name this as let. And instead of calling this form, actually, form data is right. Let's go ahead and read JSON data. Because now, instead of grabbing the HTML element, I actually want the JSON data that's in it. So I'm going to grab object from entries and pass in my form data. And when I console log this JSON form data, I'm going to actually see those key value pairs. All right, so again, this expects to be initialized by passing in the form. The constructor, and I messed this up a little bit. The constructor doesn't actually have this getter. What the constructor will do is it will inspect the form. And let me actually make this full screen because it might be too much content. It will inspect the form, find the input values that we're trying to cover, and it will set this dot name, or excuse me, this dot username is equal to the value of this input field. And then this dot favorite color is equal to the value of this input field. So that's what's happening here. We're passing in this entire HTML form. It's being passed into this form data. This form data is turning it into a readable JSON constructor. And then we're serializing it with this from entries. And that's how we get all of our form data as JSON readable, as a JSON readable object. And we pass in the HTML element. We utilize our constructor. And then our constructor gets serialized. All right, if I come back over, go ahead and do Francisco, put in my value, click submit, and I get username and favorite color. Does anyone have any questions over how to handle forms with JavaScript? Right, it doesn't seem like we have any questions. So today we covered what is the JavaScript DOM. We covered iterating through the DOM, the different types of selection methods, manipulating the DOM with JavaScript, events, and then handling forms with JavaScript. At this point, does anyone have any questions over the material that we covered during part 2 of our lecture? All right, it doesn't seem like we have any questions. Let me go ahead and stop the recording.